Anybody learn anything last week about the city of Ephesus, and that Jesus' words carry more meaning than perhaps you thought before? I hope you did. That's what I was shooting for anyway. As I said last week, a lot of people when they read Revelation, they skip or just gloss over chapters 2 and 3, and we miss a lot. Today, I hope to continue what we started last week and show you the relevance of this particular letter to the church of Smyrna. There's a lot of things about this church and the context in which it was thriving in that is very similar to the world in which we live today. And I hope that as we go through this, you will see this. Now, this is a church who was going through tremendous tribulation, and was also a church that had steadfast faith. And so I think we're going through a point in time right now, at least over the last decade, of religious persecution in some right. And we also have seen a resurgence of faith among evangelical Christians. And so I hope that this will be relative to you today. This church was one of the two churches. It's in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And I know it's only 4 verses, but there's a lot here that we can really learn from. And this was one of two churches out of the 7 that received no rebuke from Jesus. Although they received no rebuke, historical literature suggests that this was a very sinful city. So this is a steadfast church of faith in a sinful city. That's relevant today, isn't it? It very much is. But the city of Smyrna was located about 35 miles north of Ephesus. So these churches, or these churches that were in these cities, they were all in a ring. They weren't too far away from each other. Couldn't drive there, obviously, but they could ride horses or walk. But they were somewhat relative to each other on the coast of Turkey. This is one out of the 7 cities that still is in existence today. It's called the modern city of Izmir. And the reason that this city is still in existence today is because they built right over the ruins, and which is one of the reasons why we don't have as much archaeological evidence or artifacts from this church and city as we do the other 6, is because the modern city is sitting on top of it. So it's kind of hard to do excavations when you have cities sitting on top of it. So perhaps one day some of these things will be available to get to. We can learn more about this. But Izmir, you can look that up in Turkey. That's the modern city of Smyrna. Smyrna, with a few other cities nearby, they claim to be the home of a Greek writer and poet by the name of Homer. Anybody know any of his works? There's 2 very, very popular ones. You probably learned about them in school. What are they? I heard somebody whisper it. The Iliad and the Odyssey. Very good. Give yourself a hand for that. But Smyrna claims to be the home of Homer, and that it's believed that he lived around 700 BC, around that time. So a lot of literature coming out of that era. But Smyrna was in competition with Ephesus. Now, last week we talked about Ephesus being this metropolitan city and how they had they had pretty much anything and everything. Smyrna was competing with Ephesus. Ephesus was not the most important city, it wasn't the capital city, but it was the most important. So Smyrna was trying to get some of that credit, and eventually it did come around because Ephesus didn't quite take care of their seaports like they should have, and Smyrna had excellent seaports. So whenever you got a good place to dock and send out your goods and stuff like that, it helps the city, doesn't it? Case in point, Wilmington. Look at the cargo that comes in and out of Wilmington. It's because they have great ports. If they failed to keep those ports up, guess what? They would take them somewhere else and drop it off. So it's that's common sense business right there. But they were fighting over this, and they also had a great river that ran right to the city, so they could ship stuff in and out through there. Again, Roman roads led to this city, good Roman roads, just like to Ephesus. So a lot of people were able to come in and out of this city through boat and by land. The city had been given the right to govern themselves because they were an ally to Rome probably 200 years or so before the time of Christ. So they had a very good alliance with the Roman government before the Roman government actually had power in that region. And that says a lot about this time frame that John is writing in now. This was the first city to build a temple to the state goddess of Dea Roma. Now, each city had their own patron gods, but the state of Rome, or the empire, had their own patron goddess. And so Smyrna was the first city to build a temple to her. Smyrna was awarded the honor of building a temple to the Emperor Tiberius right before the time of Christ, and so that was a big honor. Smyrna had a great big library, just like Ephesus. They had a huge stadium, and they had the largest public theater in Asia. So you start thinking about these things. This was a buzzing place to be. Now, here's some of the ancient ruins. You can see the architecture is very similar to Ephesus. Now, again, a lot of it, you can see the modern city around it. So a lot of the ancient city is sitting all under that modern stuff. But as you can see here, you've got the great pillars, the walkways, and these things right here, as you see through here, we always think that people are dumb back in that day and age. They're not dumb. They had running water systems. They had aqueducts that they built in the city. They had modern sewer systems. This was a high-tech place back in the day. And so this is the context in which John is writing in. This is how it was in that day. And so when we get to the actual Scripture, I hope that some of these facts I just told you, they may seem mundane, but I hope that they make sense and fit with this. So let's get into the Scripture here. Revelation chapter 2, verse 8 says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who came and died came to life." Now, as I said last week, this is a common theme for every church that we will visit. You will see this first greeting. It'll be to a particular angel, which we said is a messenger. Could have been the pastor of the church there at the time. And each phrase after that has something to do with how Jesus described himself in chapter 1. And so again, these words can go back to chapter 1, but there's something else. Each of these references also have something to do with the city itself. A lot of times we gloss over it and we miss it. I don't want you to miss it today. The words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. All right, so Jesus is using this self-identification. Does anybody know the significance of first and last, what that means? Okay, I'll explain it to you. The phrase the first and the last is associated with the term that Jesus used in chapter 1, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Does anybody know what the Alpha and Omega means? The beginning and end. Do you know why it's the beginning and end? Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet. Well, you're saying, well, that's great. Now I know the first and last letter of the Greek alphabet. What does that mean? Well, this phrase had more meaning in that day than perhaps we do it today, but it's this term, or the definition, is still in use today, and I'll explain that. It's called a merism. It means to take two contrasting parts to describe the whole. So when Jesus said, I am the first and the last, I am the beginning and the end, it's taking two contrasting points, and it's talking about everything in between. So when Jesus says, I am the first and the last, I'm also everything in between. I am the beginning and I am the end. So you can see that it had specific meaning to Jesus' deistic qualities. But this merism, to show how we still use this today, has anybody ever heard this phrase, I searched high and low? What does that mean when I searched high and low? Does it mean I just searched at the high points and just the low points? No, it's two contrasting elements that describes the whole. Because when you say I searched high and low, I searched all the way, right? The completeness of it. Here's another one, the young and old, talking to young and old. Typically, whenever you talk about the young and old, is there a specific age group that you're talking about? When you say young and old, that's be a lot of different people, right? So this is a term that we use today that covers everyone from a baby to an older gentleman or woman, all the way in between. How about this one, life and death? Isn't there something that happens in between? All right, so this covers. I look for it night and day. All right, that's common, right? How about this one? I covered it from A to Z. That's what Jesus is saying. I've got it covered from A to Z. Literally, that's what he's talking about. Well, I've got it covered from Alpha to Omega. But that's what he's getting at. He's the first and the last. And each of these letters, or at least this letter, is an encouragement to this church. And so these words have significance to them. The second part of this is who died and came to life. Now, this has significance to the city more than you might think. Several centuries earlier, the Greeks had come and destroyed the city of Smyrna. And so it sat dormant for almost 2 centuries. And so it was a dead city. Now, after I just described to you some of the aspects of this city during John's day, it didn't seem like it was dead, was it? It seemed like it was very much alive. Historians think that during this time period, there were probably as many as 200,000 residents in the city of Smyrna. It's a pretty good-sized population, isn't it? I would say it was thriving, very much so. But this was a city who was once dead, but is now alive. You see the significance. Well, this was a church one time, too, that was once dead and is now alive. And, of course, this would have great impact on the church because the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that he did, in fact, die, but he did, in fact, come to life. And so, with the city and with Christ himself and the church, this had specific meaning. And so it was an encouragement to them that the one who was the beginning and the end, the one who had died and come to life, he was writing this letter of encouragement to them. Whenever there's someone that you look up to, isn't it always an encouragement whenever they say a good word? It is, especially when you're in a tough spot. Remember a few weeks ago I mentioned about a woman who had passed away and her ministry was writing cards? That encouraging word. That's what Smyrna. Smyrna was in the midst of great tribulation. They were in the midst of great persecution, as we will see. Verse 9, Jesus says, I know your tribulation. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, some of these things, they seem tricky. You read over and say, all right, what does this stuff mean? Well, you got to go back to context. You got to know a little bit of history, which is one of the things I think why people skip over this because they don't want to do their homework. So I did my homework for you. But next time I expect you to do it. And there will be a quiz. But by the time John wrote this book of Revelation, the city itself had started abandoning worship of all the gods that they had as the most important thing. And they started transitioning that importance of their gods to emperor worship. And now it was under the Emperor Domitian that emperor worship became mandatory. And under that mandatory worship, one of the things that he implemented was that they had to go and give an incense offering once a year and say that Caesar is Lord. What he's really saying is, you are God and Lord. Because at this point, Domitian was, the emperors were saying that they were a God incarnate. That they were the actual God in flesh. And so this emperor was the one who instituted this. And Domitian was in power when John wrote this letter. He had been in power for about 14 years. And so this was becoming more and widespread. And with the affiliation that Smyrna had with the Roman Empire, it's only natural that they would choose to do this. Now, this posed a problem to Christians, did it not? Because a Christian living in that city, all citizens had to go and proclaim that Caesar is Lord and God. That's a problem. Now, if you couldn't say those words, it was the penalty of death. And there were many Christians who were put to death because they would not say those few words. This country's not there yet, but we could be. There are people who want to make a country like that. And we need to pray. You know, it's a unique thing in this country that we have the responsibility and the ability to appoint representatives who support our beliefs. Never forget that those who are in power in this country are not leaders. They are representatives. And if they are there, that means that we put them there. And if you don't like them there, then you have the power to get them out of there. These people did not have that choice. We do. I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Get back to this. But they were under tribulation, and a lot of it had to do with the government. Rome had a very strong presence there, and under Domitian, it was a lot easier to persecute Christians at this time than it had been in years prior. And when Jesus said, I know your tribulation, you know, all the time we think about tribulation, we just think, well, it's problems. Well, death, because you don't say a few words, more than just a problem, isn't it? You know, there are places in the world right now where this happens. There are people who are under tribulation. Tribulation is a mild word. A better term for it would be severe persecution. We don't experience that here. We don't know what this is like, but other people do. There are places in the world where Christians do undergo severe persecution. A lot of people don't like to accept this, but Christians are the most widely abused and killed religious group in the world. And that grows more and more every year. And that's a sad thing. But it means more than just trouble. Jesus said, I know what kind of trouble you are in. I know what kind of persecution you're going through. Christianity was not a legal religion as compared to the Jewish religion. The Christianity used to be under an umbrella. And so the Romans kind of tolerated Christianity until a certain point. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they were allowed to operate somewhat under this religious Jewish umbrella because this is one of those things where you need to learn Jewish history. The Jews went before all these kings, had went before all these powers, and had refused to give allegiance to these powers. And they said, we're going to believe in one God and one God only. And they kept being killed and killed and killed. And it was relentless. So finally the Roman Empire said, you know what? It doesn't matter how many of these people we kill, they're not going to come around to our way of thinking. So we're going to give them a little leeway. And it was the only group that they did that to. The Jews did not have to go and offer incense. And so under this rule, of course, Jesus was what? He was a Jew. And so when Christianity began, Christianity was seen under this umbrella of Judaism. And so for a while, they did afford some sort of protection from the Roman Empire. But the Jews had a big hand in what happened after this. Well, as I said, we'll get to that in a moment. But the Jews were kind of grandfathered in, I guess you'd say. And Jesus says, I know your poverty. I know you're poor. Now, there's different levels of poor. There's different levels of poverty. The way that the Greeks worded this was that they pretty much had nothing. Jesus said, I know that you have nothing. Now, sometimes when you're put in places like that, is it hard to keep your faith? For some people, it is. For other people, it's a rallying cry. And I think that was for Smyrna. It was a rallying cry. Jesus said, I know that you're extremely poor and you basically have nothing. There's some historians who believe that the Jewish and Gentile presence there in this city actually robbed the Christians and would not sell anything to them. So they made it even more difficult for them. Now, can you imagine going out here and explaining to someone, we're going to eat lunch today, I'm assuming. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to go eat lunch somewhere, or either we're going to fix it at home. Now, if we go out to provide lunch today at our homes, we had to go buy it somewhere, didn't we? Now, what if somebody knew that you were a Christian and you went to buy something and they said, we're not going to sell it to you? Or what if you went to a restaurant and said, oh, I'm not going to serve you because you're a Christian? That's what they were experiencing. All the luxuries that they were being afforded at one time were now depleting. Not only that, they were being robbed. This is still happening today in our society. In the last decade, we've seen some of this here where there have been people who have been refused service. And Christians have paid the penalty for it. Also, Christians couldn't have businesses because people would refuse to buy from them. So Jesus knew. He knew how bad off they were. He says, but I also know how rich you are. And he wasn't talking about being materially wealthy, because obviously it contradicts one another, doesn't it? To say, I know how poor you are, but you're also rich. So obviously it didn't mean wealthy as in material. It meant spiritual. This is the steadfast church of faith. I would love, wouldn't this be a great banner for everybody who knows about Providence would say, that's a steadfast church. They have a steadfast faith. They may not have a coliseum to worship out of. They may not have the best speaking preacher. You know, he talks a little redneck at times, or a lot of the time. A lot of times, people judge from the outside. They look at things and say, well, things are just not, they don't look like they have much. Does that matter? What does matter? Steadfast faith. We can model this church. It would be nice if we were known as this throughout the community, that this is a church who has steadfast faith in the midst of persecution. And then he goes on to say, talking about the slander of those who say they're Jews but are not. And as I said, there was a Jewish presence there, and they were trying to stay, and they played politics really well. Really well. They played to whichever side that kept them in business, I guess you'd say. So they wanted to appease the Roman government. And so in doing so, they wanted to stay in this good standing. They had no problem bringing false accusations against Christians. There's a pretty big one that we hang our faith on, isn't it? You know that when they hung Jesus on the cross? Those were out of false allegations. So they had no problem doing that. Now what happened? Now there was a time where Jews didn't do this as much. But now they got to a point where they did. It was no problem because they were wanting to save face. They were wanting to keep themselves in the good graces of the government. So what they did was about 5 years before John wrote this book of Revelation, the Jews put together a document called the Curse of Minim. Now what this document did was it encouraged Jews to disassociate themselves from anybody who was a Jewish Christian or any Christian who went to the synagogue. Now, if you remember, if you read through the Gospels, if you read through the entire New Testament, where did the preachers go to first? They went to the synagogues. The synagogues was where the Jews worshiped. Paul talks extensively about the gospel going to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. All right, so the Jews said, look, we're not going to have any more of this. In order to appease the Roman government, we're going to, anybody who claims to be a Christian, you're out of the synagogue. You can't worship here no more. Any Jew who claimed to be a Christian or have any Christian ties, you're out of here, brother. These were people who had steadfast faith, but were being kicked out of institutions. They were going against the grain. That's not very popular these days, is it? We see a lot of churches, a lot of people who claim to be Christians who have no steadfast faith. They cater to what's popular. Being a Christian is not easy, especially in a time like this that John was living in, and these people knew it. But Jesus knew. Jesus knew. He knew the trouble they were in, but he also knew their steadfast faith. But what this did, it caused a big problem. Has anybody ever heard of a guy named Polycarp? He was one of the first Christian martyrs. He was not the first, but he was one of the first. Or the one that's really been remembered. He was the bishop in Smyrna for about 50 years, or about 50 years after the letter of Revelation was written. And it said that in these letters, it said that the Jews hated him so much that they brought false accusations to the Romans, and they had a willingness to have him thrown to the lions or burned at the stake. Now, if you read the whole story of Polycarp, it's really amazing because the people who went and arrested him didn't want to. They actually came the first time and he was sleeping, so they went because they didn't want to disturb him, and then they came back because they had to. And they took him to the stake, and even the Romans knew who this guy was, and they were pleading with him, please, just say these words so they don't do this. He said, I'm not doing it. He said, I'm going to have a steadfast faith. And so the crowd, the Jews, were there cheering on, instigating for his death. And so they lit a fire. At the stake, they lit it, but he wasn't burning. He was miraculously staying alive. And then someone came, and I know some of you might want to plug your ears who don't like grotesque things. You kids are going to love this. They took and sliced him open, and they said that all the blood put the fire out. So he didn't die by fire. He died a very quick death. But he's been memorialized as a steadfast Christian for not saying just a few words. These Jews that he's talking about, that Jesus is discussing, these are Jews that were recognized by name and appearance only. They were not recognized as spiritual Jews. We call that today, we call that big C Christian and little c Christian. There are people who are cultural Christians, but who aren't spiritual Christians. I know we're not supposed to judge, but it's pretty obvious. Those who bear no fruit, who call themselves Christians. Those who compromise on every issue that the church is battling against. Those are little c Christians. Those people who would claim that Jesus didn't really exist, that he was just a historical Jesus, but he wasn't a divine Jesus. Those are Christians with a little c. those are not true spiritual Christians. They had the same problem then. They had Jews who were not spiritual Jews. Now, what were Jews supposed to be? Jews were supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. The Word of God came to the Jews first. And they gave up on it. They gave it over. So Jesus called him out on it. Remember when he was accused of not being God, not being Son of God, and he told them, he said, you know what? I know who your father is. It's Satan. Ouch. Talk about stinging. Whew. How many of you would like to be told that you're a son of Satan? I don't know anybody that wants that, but that's what he said to the Jews. He said, your father's Satan. And so when he says here that these are not really Jews but are a synagogue of Satan, that means he's saying that it's not really coming from the Jews, it's really coming from Satan. That's where the true persecution's really coming from. That's where it's coming from today. It's that spirit of evil. Church, we've got to stand up to it. If we don't stand up to it, who's going to? Jesus gives them a little more encouragement. He says, do not fear, in verse 10, what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Jesus knew what they were going through. And he knew that they were going to suffer. But he was encouraging them that something better was going to come. Today, when we are suffering, today when we feel persecution, when we are slighted, we can be confident in knowing that there is something better that awaits us. This pastor who was jailed in Turkey for 2 years, he knew that there was something better awaiting him even if he didn't make it. He was still faithful. He was still preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ in the midst of imprisonment. How many of us can say the same thing? How many of us have that steadfast faith? I would encourage you to highly think about that. But Jesus said, I know you're about to suffer, but don't fear. And then he says, he's throwing it back again where this is coming from. He said, behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you might be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Now, it seems that though the thought of death would encourage some people to change their mind whether they were Christians or not. Now, if you'll just say these words, we'll let you out of prison. If you'll just say that Caesar is Lord and God, we'll let you out of prison, and you can go on living your life. How easy would it have been for these Christians who were in jail to say, you know what? Caesar's Lord and God. I can do that. I can say that. And I can walk out of here scot-free. But they didn't. They knew that something better awaited them, even in the midst of persecution. They stood fast. They were thrown into prison. They were tested. And this phrase, this 10 days you will have tribulation, there are so many different interpretations of what this means. But I think, I'm a guy that's about context. I think that's something we need to look at. I think the probable of all the interpretations is that generally, historically, Romans would throw people like this in prison for 10 days. The punishment was already death, but they would throw them into prison for 10 days. After 10 days, they would take them out and throw them into the Colosseum, where they were forced to either fight the gladiators or forced to fight off the wild creatures, the lions, the tigers, and the bears. Oh my! Many of them had skins put on them so that the animals would attack them even more fierce. That was what awaited. 10 days they had to think about that. Jesus said, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, this crown of life, it also had significance to the city of Smyrna. Mount Pagus was a small mountain there in Smyrna, and it was called the crown of the Roman Empire because at the top of Mount Pagus, they had this crown of temples around the top. All these pagan temples, and these were beautiful temples, all arrayed and decked out, and as people were coming into the city, they saw this crown jewel of the Roman Empire. They had all these temples, and some say that it even had a road called the Street of Gold that circled around these temples. There was a temple to Zeus at one end and a temple to Sibyl at the other end. In between, there were temples to Apollo, Asclepius, and Aphrodite. So they had their choice of sin at the top of this, but this was the crown jewel of the Roman Empire. But Jesus said, you see that, but I have something greater. I have the crown of life. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And this was the victor's crown. This was the Stephanos crown. There's two crowns in the Greek language. There's the diadem and there's the Stephanos crown. The Stephanos crown was the one that they gave you if you won in an athletic event. These were people who were running the race of life. These were people who were running the race of faith, and they were winning. And Jesus said, I'm going to give you that crown of life, but please be faithful unto death. You know, there's a lot of people who turned around on that faith, and they chose to accept death instead of the crown of life. You don't have to. That's what Jesus is saying. You don't have to. It's your choice. We all have the ability to accept the crown of life or the pit of death. We all have that choice. And every day we walk around with that. Every day people in this world walk around with that choice. Are we confident enough in our faith to help someone else who isn't to show them that they also can choose the crown of life? Jesus explains this crown of life, what it means if you accept it. In verse 11, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers, this is those who are faithful unto death, will not be hurt by the second death. Now the second death, if you go over to Revelation chapter 20, it explains it real well. This second death is your spiritual death. Everyone dies at some point. The book of Hebrews tells us that all men are appointed to die once. That's men and women, so, women don't jump for joy yet. It is appointed unto men and women all to die once. And when you die, when you physically die, that separates your physical body from your soul. And your soul goes somewhere. And where that soul goes is entirely up to you. You can choose the pit of death, or you can choose the crown of life. You can choose that spiritual death if you like, but that spiritual death, that second death, is eternal separation from Jesus Christ. It is eternal separation from Jesus Christ, and it is eternal damnation for you. Doesn't sound so rosy, does it? But that is your choice. You have the choice, and you are the only one who can make that choice. You can choose life or death. Anybody ever heard of a man named Dwight Moody? Dwight L. Moody? Wonderful man of God. He came along before Billy Graham. I think Billy Graham was a product down the line of D.L. Moody's ministry. Now, we know how many people Billy Graham reached in his lifetime. Millions. People say that D.L. Moody, without TV, without radio, without the internet, all he had was newspapers and horse and buggy and foot travel, that he reached over 100 million people in his lifetime. That's pretty amazing. And thank God that Billy Graham was a product of that. But this man, if you ever get a chance to read anything he's ever wrote, read it. He has an amazing testimony. Of course, he's dead now, but still has an amazing testimony. He had this quote. He said, "He who is born once will die twice. He who is born twice will die once." Let me repeat that again. He who is born once will die twice, and he who is born twice will die once. Jesus told Nicodemus in John chapter 3, unless you are born again, unless you are born twice, first time physically, second time spiritually, unless you are born twice, you will only die once. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and life, and no man comes through me." Or no man comes to the Father except through me. That's the same today as then. It all falls back to that choice. You can choose life or you can choose death. You can choose to be born once and die twice, or you can choose to be born twice and die once. Life or death. Light or darkness. Love or hell. That's what it boils down to. It's your choice. I'll leave it to you today for you to make that choice. I can't make that decision for you, and no friend, no family can make that choice for you. That is a personal decision. That's why we call it a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Challenge you this week. Think about the steadfast faith and love that these people have for Jesus Christ in the midst of trial and tribulation, in the midst of death. Could you hold up to it? Could you remain steadfast in the face of that? This country is not immune to what could happen. Some of you older folks who have great-grandchildren, it is within the realm of possibility that within their lifetime they could experience the very same things that the people in Smyrna did. Do you want them to have a steadfast faith, or do you want them to compromise? When they get to when it comes time for them to die, do you want to see them in heaven, or is it going to settle good for you to know that they might go to hell? Think about that. Let's all stand and have a closing prayer.